Picture this: four men emerging from the Atlantic Ocean onto a Florida beach in the dead of night, June 1942. They're wearing bathing trunks and German military caps. Yes, you heard that right. Swimming trunks and Wehrmacht headgear. This wasn't a beach party. This was Hitler's most elaborate sabotage operation on American soil, and it was doomed the moment they stepped onto that sand. What I'm about to tell you sounds impossible. The Nazi regime, with all its meticulous planning and feared intelligence apparatus, sent 8 trained saboteurs to destroy America's war infrastructure. They gave them months of training, $84,000 in cash. That's over $1.5 million today, and enough explosives to wage a 2-year terror campaign. They prepared for every contingency, every scenario, every possible obstacle, except one. They dressed them wrong, a detail smaller than your thumb, a button, a cap, a fabric choice, destroyed the only real chance Germany had to bring the war to American soil. But here's the part you do not want to miss. One of these men was still wearing his swimming trunks when the Coast Guard found him. Not because he was swimming, but because the plan was so catastrophically flawed that he literally didn't have time to finish getting dressed before everything fell apart. In Amagansett Beach, Long Island, around 12:30 a.m. on June 13th, 1942. The fog rolling off the Atlantic is so thick you could cut it with a knife. 21-year-old Coast Guardsman John Cullen is on solo patrol, walking the shoreline like he does every night. His flashlight, completely useless in this soup. He's basically navigating by sound and instinct. Then he sees them. 4 shapes materializing out of the fog like ghosts. But these aren't ghosts, they're men. And they're wearing German Kriegsmarine uniforms, the unmistakable dark blue wool of the Nazi Navy. Brass buttons catching what little moonlight penetrates the mist. Cullen's 21 years old. He's unarmed, and he's staring at what looks like an enemy invasion force. His training kicks in. He calls out, "Who are you?" The leader, a middle-aged man, steps forward. He's calm, almost friendly. "We're fishermen from Southampton," he says in perfect English. "We've run ashore." For a second, Cullen considers it. Maybe they are fishermen. Maybe... Then a second figure appears over the dune and shouts something in German. The leader spins around furious. "You damn fool! Go back to the others!" And that's when Cullen knows. He's alone on a beach with Nazi saboteurs. The leader turns back, gets right in Cullen's face. His voice drops to a hiss. "Do you have a mother? A father?" Cullen nods, paralyzed. "Well, I wouldn't want to have to kill you." Then he does something bizarre. He pulls out a wad of cash. $260, equivalent to about $4,800 today, and shoves it into Cullen's hand. "Take this money, go have a good time, forget about this." But here's where it gets even stranger. He grabs Cullen's flashlight, points it at his own face, making sure the young Coast Guardsman gets a good long look at him, like he wants to be identified. Cullen, realizing this might be his only chance to escape alive, takes the money and runs. By dawn, Coast Guard patrols are scouring that beach, and what they find changes everything. Footprints leading up from the surf, a patch of freshly disturbed sand. They start digging and unearth a cache that makes their blood run cold. 4 complete German naval uniforms, boxes of explosives, primers, incendiaries, timing devices, and $84,000 in cash, a fortune that could fund operations for years. The FBI is notified immediately. J. Edgar Hoover orders a complete news blackout and launches the largest manhunt in Bureau history. But nobody knows yet that this is only half the story. 4 days later, that was June 17th, 1942, Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida, just south of Jacksonville. Another German submarine surfaces in darkness. Another 4-man team prepares to land. This crew has learned something from their counterparts up north. They're not wearing full military uniforms for the beach landing. No, they've got a better idea. They're wearing bathing trunks and German Army forage caps. Let me repeat that for emphasis. The second wave of Hitler's master sabotage plan walked onto American soil in swimwear and military headgear, like they're headed to some nightmare beach resort where the dress code is enemy combatant casual. Somehow, and I still can't wrap my head around this, They make it off the beach. They walk to Highway 1. They catch a Greyhound bus to Jacksonville wearing this getup. The bus driver sees four men in swimming trunks and German military caps and apparently thinks, sure, seems normal. Welcome to wartime Florida, I guess. When the FBI finally catches them and examines their equipment, they find sabotage gear that's actually sophisticated. Timing devices that can be constructed from easily obtainable items. Dried peas, lumps of sugar, razor blades, explosives carefully disguised, detailed target lists. And what are those targets? Not military bases, not just industrial sites. Hell Gate Bridge, the most critical rail junction in the Northeast. Destroy it, and you paralyze supply lines to Europe. The Niagara Falls hydroelectric plant cripples it, and aluminum production for aircraft grinds to a halt. Railroad terminals in Cincinnati and St. Louis, the heart of American logistics. Aluminum factories in Philadelphia and East St. Louis. And here's where it gets dark. Small acts of terrorism, including suitcase bombs, aimed specifically at Jewish-owned shops. This wasn't just sabotage. This was a campaign designed to terrify, to cripple, to kill. So, here's what doesn't make sense, and I need you to stay with me, because this is where the story gets truly bizarre. These 8 men, George Dash, Ernest Berger, Herbert Haupt, Edward Curling, and 4 others, were elite operatives. They had all lived in America before. They spoke fluent English. They spent months at a specialized sabotage school at Quens Lake outside Berlin, learning how to build bombs, blow bridges, and move undetected through enemy territory. The operation had a budget of $84,000. That's $1.5 million in today's money. Hitler himself signed off on this. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence, personally oversaw the planning. This was the Reich's best shot at bringing the war to American soil. And yet, why did they wear military uniforms at all? If you're trying to infiltrate enemy territory, why dress like the enemy? Why make yourself so obviously, undeniably, unmistakably foreign? And that man in the swimming trunks, why didn't he have time to change? What went so catastrophically wrong that he was still half-dressed when the Coast Guard patrol showed up? But here's the question that historians have wrestled with for decades. How did the most feared intelligence service in the world make such fundamental, almost childish mistakes about clothing? Because this wasn't just about uniforms. When the FBI arrested these men and examined their civilian clothes, they found error after error after error, details so obvious, so glaring, that any observant American would have spotted them immediately. This wasn't incompetence. This was strategic suicide. The uniform choice was deliberate. There's a cold logic behind it that I'll explain. But the execution revealed something darker, something that gets to the heart of why Germany lost the intelligence war before it even began. There was a fatal blind spot, arrogance, an assumption that Americans wouldn't notice, wouldn't care, wouldn't be smart enough to spot the details that screamed enemy agent. And there was one man among those 8 who knew, from the very beginning, that this mission was doomed. Who put on that German naval uniform on a foggy Long Island beach and made a decision that would save thousands of American lives. But to understand why these uniforms doomed 8 men, to understand why clothing became the weapon that destroyed Hitler's only real terror plot on U.S. soil, we need to go back 9 months earlier, to a humiliation that enraged the Fuhrer, to a spy ring that collapsed in a single day, to the moment when Hitler screamed at his intelligence chiefs and demanded revenge. That's where this story really begins. September 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor. The United States isn't even in the war yet, but the FBI just pulled off the most devastating counterintelligence operation in American history. In a single day, they arrested 33 German agents. 33. The Duquesne spy ring, named after its leader, Fritz Duquesne, a South African-born spy who'd been working for Germany since World War I, had spent years building a network across the United States. They'd infiltrated defense contractors, photographed military installations, stolen blueprints for the Norden bomb site, and gathered intelligence on convoy departures. They were everywhere: docks, factories, military bases, and the FBI took them all down in one coordinated sweep. It remains to this day the largest espionage case in U.S. history. Every single member was convicted. The network was completely dismantled. How? One man, William Siebold. Siebold was a German-American who'd returned to Germany to visit family in 1939. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, tried to recruit him. They had leverage. His family still lived in Germany, so Siebold agreed. He said yes, he'd spy for the fatherland. Then he walked straight into the U.S. consulate in Cologne and told them everything. The FBI turned him into a double agent. For 2 years, Siebold fed the Germans information, carefully crafted lies mixed with just enough truth to keep them believing. He opened a radio station in New York that the Germans thought was theirs. He introduced new German agents to the network. He gathered names, dates, methods. And when the FBI had everything they needed, they struck. The news reached Berlin like a thunderclap. 33 agents, years of work, gone. Hitler's reaction was volcanic. In a conference room at the Reich Chancellery, he screamed at his intelligence chiefs. Witnesses reported he was so furious, he was shaking. "Someone always talks," he roared. "Someone always talks." But his rage wasn't just about the arrests. It was about humiliation. The United States, not even officially at war yet, had just proven they could dismantle German intelligence operations at will, that the vaunted Abwehr, which had run rings around the British and French, could be beaten by American G-men. Hitler wanted revenge, immediate revenge. He demanded sabotage operations against the United States, not intelligence gathering, not quiet espionage. He wanted explosions, casualties, terror. He wanted Americans to know that Germany could strike them at home, and he wanted it now. The order landed on the desk of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, chief of the Abwehr. Canaris was a fascinating contradiction, brilliant, methodical, deeply cultured, but also conflicted. Historians still debate where his true loyalties lay. Some evidence suggests he was secretly working against Hitler. Other records show him as a loyal officer caught in an impossible position. What's certain is this: when Hitler ordered sabotage operations in America, Canaris knew it was doomed. He'd studied the Duquesne collapse. He understood what Siebold's betrayal meant. And he knew the fundamental law of intelligence work that Hitler refused to accept. The more people involved in an operation, the more likely someone talks. Canaris tried to warn him. In that same meeting, he said, "Any program involving more than a handful of men, someone always talks." He was literally quoting Hitler's own words back at him. Hitler's response: "Do it anyway. You don't argue with the Führer. You don't refuse." Canaris had seen what happened to officers who pushed back too hard, so he saluted, left the room, and went to find someone expendable enough to run a mission he knew would fail. He chose Lieutenant Walter Kappa. Walter Kappa seemed like the perfect man for the job. On paper, anyway. He'd lived in America from 1925 to 1937, 12 years. He spoke perfect, unaccented English. He'd worked for German-language newspapers in New York and Chicago. He'd been a leader in the German-American Bund, the pro-Nazi organization that held rallies in Madison Square Garden. He knew American cities, American culture, how Americans thought and moved and talked. When Canaris put him in charge of Operation Pastorius, named after Francis Daniel Pastorius, the founder of the first German settlement in America, Germantown, Pennsylvania, Kappa threw himself into the work. He named the operation carefully, with historical resonance. He drew up target lists. He identified sabotage objectives that would cause maximum damage: the Hellgate Bridge, Niagara Falls hydroelectric plant, aluminum factories that fed aircraft production, railroad terminals that moved war materiel. But Kappa had one fatal flaw that he never recognized. He'd left America in 1937. It was now 1942. 5 years doesn't sound like much, but those 5 years had transformed America completely. In 1937, America was neutral, isolationist, divided. By 1942, after Pearl Harbor, the nation had militarized overnight. Coastal surveillance had intensified 100-fold. Rationing had changed what people wore, ate, bought. Wartime paranoia meant every stranger was suspect, every accent noticed, every unusual behavior reported. Kappa was planning an operation based on an America that no longer existed, and he didn't know it. He thought he understood Americans. That was his greatest mistake. Kappa's first task was recruitment. He needed men who could pass as Americans, men who spoke fluent English, who knew American customs, who could disappear into New York or Chicago without raising suspicion. Abwehr's personnel files gave him exactly what he needed. George John Dash, 39 years old. He'd lived in the United States for 19 years, working as a waiter in restaurants from San Francisco to New York. Spoke English like a native because he basically was one. Ernest Peter Berger, 36. A naturalized U.S. citizen who'd served in the American National Guard before returning to Germany. He knew America intimately, and more importantly, he understood American military thinking. Herbert Hans Haupt, just 22. Born in Germany, but raised in Chicago. His family still lived there. He could walk into his old neighborhood and nobody would question him. Edward John Curling, 33. Had lived in New York for years. Knew the city like the back of his hand. The others, Heinrich Henk, Richard Quirin, Hermann Neubauer, Werner Thiel, all had similar backgrounds. Years in America, perfect English, deep familiarity with American life. On paper, they were ideal, sleeper agents who could blend seamlessly back into the country they had once called home. But here's the detail that doomed them, the detail that nobody in Berlin understood. None of them had been in America since 1939. 3 years, that's all. 3 years since they had walked American streets, spoken to American shopkeepers, and ridden American buses. 3 years during which everything had changed. The slang had evolved, the fashion had shifted. Rationing had altered what was available, what people wore, how they moved through daily life. The national mood had transformed from peace to war. Every city now had military checkpoints, coastal patrols, suspicious neighbors who reported anything unusual. These men were trained for an America that had ceased to exist, and they had no idea. At Quenz Lake, outside Berlin, the Abwehr established what they called a sabotage school. For weeks, the 8 men trained. They learned how to build bombs from everyday materials. Dried peas could be used as timing devices. Sugar lumps could create delays. Razor blades could trigger detonators. They practiced demolition techniques on mock bridges. They memorized the structural weaknesses of American railroad terminals, power plants, and industrial facilities. The technical training was excellent. These men could have blown up half of New York if given the chance. But you know what they weren't taught? How to use 1942 ration books, what the current price of gasoline was, what American slang had evolved into, how to act like someone who'd lived through Pearl Harbor, what questions a suspicious shopkeeper might ask, how coastal patrols had intensified since December 7th. They spent weeks learning to build bombs and 0 hours learning to be Americans in 1942, and then came the uniform decision. In a conference room in Berlin, officers who'd never set foot on an American beach made a choice based on the Geneva Convention. If captured during landing, the saboteurs should be wearing military uniforms. That way, they'd be treated as prisoners of war, not spies. Spies could be executed. POWs had rights. It made perfect sense in a Berlin conference room. It would prove catastrophically stupid on a foggy Long Island beach. The fatal assumption, repeated in meeting after meeting, recorded in operation orders, was simple. They'll never spot us at night. We'll land in darkness, bury the uniforms, change into civilian clothes. By dawn, we'll be invisible. They assumed darkness would protect them, that American coastal patrols were lazy or incompetent, that a few men could land on a beach undetected. They were wrong on every count. Then, on May 26, 1942, U-202 submerged off the coast of France with 4 men aboard, Dash, Berger, Henk, and Quirin. 4 days later, U-584 followed with the second team, Curling, Haupt, Neubauer, and Thiel. The submarines carried them across the Atlantic. 3 weeks of cramped, suffocating conditions. Time to think. Time to rehearse their covers. Time to wonder if this would work. And time for at least one man, George Dash, to realize that the moment he put on that German naval uniform and stepped onto American soil, he was already dead. The uniforms weren't protection. They were evidence. They were confessions. They were surrender. But the submarines were already moving. The operation was in motion. and in less than 3 weeks those uniforms would destroy everything. The night of June 12th, 1942, U-202 surfaces off the coast of Long Island near Amagansett Beach. Captain Hans-Heinz Lindner has a problem. His submarine has run aground. They're stuck on a sandbar about 200 yards from shore, engines grinding, the hull scraping against the ocean floor. Every second they spend this close to the American coast increases the risk of detection. Lindner needs to get his 4 passengers off this boat and get the hell out of here. George Dash, Ernest Berger, Heinrich Heinck, and Richard Quirin climb into an inflatable raft. They're wearing full German Kriegsmarine uniforms, dark blue wool jackets, military trousers, brass buttons with the eagle and swastika, naval insignia on the sleeves. In the fog and darkness, they're supposed to be invisible. Except submarines don't normally run aground. The delay has thrown off the timing. Dawn is closer than planned, and the fog, while thick, keeps shifting with the wind. Dash grabs the oars. The raft pitches in the surf. A wave nearly capsizes them. Dash loses his grip and almost drowns before Berger hauls him back. They're soaked, cold, disoriented. This is not how elite sabotage operations are supposed to start. They hit the beach at approximately 12:30 a.m. 4 men in unmistakable German military uniforms stumble onto American soil. Even in the fog, even in the darkness, there's no mistaking what they're wearing. The dark blue wool of the Kriegsmarine doesn't look like civilian clothing from any angle. The brass buttons catch even minimal light. The cut of the uniforms, military precision tailoring, is completely different from anything an American fisherman or civilian would wear. They drag the raft up the beach. They start unloading wooden crates filled with explosives, timing devices, primers, and incendiaries. 4 crates total, enough material to wage a 2-year sabotage campaign. And then they start changing. They strip off the wet naval uniforms. They bury them quickly in shallow graves, dug with their hands and small shovels. They pull civilian clothes from waterproof bags, suits, shirts, ties, shoes, American clothing purchased in Lisbon and Paris, selected to help them blend in. But they're rushing now. The submarine is still stuck. They can hear the engines grinding. They're nervous, fumbling with buttons, trying to dress in near-total darkness while soaking wet and freezing. One of them, and FBI, records never clarified which one, is still wearing bathing trunks when John Cullen appears out of the fog. He never finished changing. Let's stop here and talk about why they wore those uniforms at all, because this is where German military thinking revealed its fatal flaw. The logic was Geneva Convention protocol. Under international law, if you're captured while wearing a military uniform, you're a prisoner of war. POWs have rights. They can't be summarily executed. They're held until the war ends, then repatriated. But if you're caught in civilian clothes committing acts of war, espionage, sabotage, assassination, you're a spy, and spies can be executed immediately. So, the Abwehr made what seemed like a smart calculation. Wear uniforms during the landing. If caught in the act, claim POW status. Then once you're safely ashore and change into civilian clothes, you're just another face in the crowd. In a Berlin conference room, this made perfect sense. On a foggy American beach with a Coast Guard patrol approaching, it was suicide. Because here's what the planners never considered: the psychology of wearing a uniform. When you dress like a soldier, you think like a soldier, you move like a soldier, and soldiers expect to be caught. That's why they wear identifying uniforms in the first place. So, when they're captured, everyone knows who they are. The moment these 4 men put on those Kriegsmarine uniforms, they'd already mentally surrendered. The uniforms didn't make them feel protected. They made them feel exposed, visible, identifiable. And that expectation created hesitation, slowness, panic. German military bureaucratic thinking at its finest. Follow the protocol even when the protocol guarantees failure. John Cullen sees 4 figures in the darkness. He calls out, "Who are you?" George Dash steps forward. He's wearing, and this is important, a German naval uniform, dark blue wool, brass buttons, the whole official getup. And he says, "We're fishermen from Southampton. We've run ashore." Think about that for a second. A man in a German military uniform claiming to be a fisherman. Cullen's young, but he's not stupid. Something is very, very wrong here. Then the second man, probably Berger, appears over the dune and shouts something in German. The exact words are lost to history, but the language isn't. Sharp German consonants cutting through the fog. Dash wheels around furious. "You damn fool! Go back to the others!" And now Cullen knows for certain. These aren't fishermen. These are enemy agents. Dash realizes the situation is collapsing. He grabs Cullen, gets right in his face. "Do you have a mother? A father?" Cullen nods, terrified. "Well, I wouldn't want to have to kill you." He pulls out a wad of cash, $260, which in 1942 is nearly 5 months' salary for a Coast Guardsman, and shoves it into Cullen's hand. "Take this money. Go have a good time. Forget about this. Forget you saw us." Then Dash does something that makes no tactical sense whatsoever. He grabs Cullen's flashlight, turns it on, and points it directly at his own face. He holds it there for several seconds, making absolutely sure the young Coast Guardsman gets a clear, unmistakable look at him. Why would a saboteur do this? Why would you deliberately let a witness memorize your face? Because George Dash was already planning to defect. He'd decided, maybe on the submarine, maybe the moment he stepped onto that beach, in a German uniform, that this mission was doomed, that he needed an exit strategy, that the only way he'd survive this was by turning himself in, and the uniform gave him the perfect excuse. He could claim later that he knew he'd been spotted, knew the Coast Guard would find the buried equipment, knew the mission was compromised from the moment Cullen stumbled onto them. The uniform wasn't protection, it was his insurance policy. Cullen runs. He sprints back toward the Coast Guard station, heart pounding, clutching the cash, trying to process what just happened. Meanwhile, Dash and his team finish changing, or try to. They bury the uniforms alongside the explosives in shallow graves scraped into the sand. They cover everything with a thin layer of beach sediment. They walk inland, find the Amagansett train station, and catch the Long Island Railroad into New York City. By dawn, Coast Guard patrols are back at the beach. They find Cullen's footprints. They find other footprints, 4 sets leading up from the water. They find the disturbed sand. They start digging. 4 German Kriegsmarine uniforms, complete with insignia, buttons, identification marks, wooden crates filled with explosives, timers, detonators, primers, and $84,000 in cash. The FBI is alerted immediately. J. Edgar Hoover personally takes charge. He orders a complete news blackout. The public cannot know that German saboteurs have landed on American soil. Panic would be catastrophic. But here's the crucial detail everyone misses. If those men had landed in civilian clothes, if they'd buried their equipment without the uniforms, the FBI might have thought they were smugglers, bootleggers, black market operators, criminals, yes, but not military saboteurs. The German uniforms made it unmistakable. This was an act of war, an enemy military operation on U.S. soil. The uniforms the Abwehr thought would protect their men actually ensured maximum response. Hoover launched the largest manhunt in FBC history. Every agent, every resource, every informant was activated. The men in those uniforms had just painted targets on their backs that would never come off. June 17th, 1942. 5 days after the Long Island disaster. U-584 surfaces off Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida, just south of Jacksonville. Edward Curling leads the second team, Werner Thiel, Hermann Neubauer, and Herbert Haupt. They've heard nothing from Dash's group. Radio silence was part of the operational plan. But they know the Long Island landing happened. Curling makes a tactical adjustment. They're landing in Florida in June. It's warm. Swimming at night isn't suspicious here like it would be in New York. Thus, so they land wearing bathing trunks and German Army forage caps. Let me paint you this picture. 4 men wade out of the Atlantic Ocean at dawn wearing swimming trunks and Wehrmacht military headgear. The caps are unmistakable, field gray with the eagle and swastika insignia. They walk across the beach. They walk to Highway 1. And they catch a Greyhound bus to Jacksonville. 4 men, bathing suits, German military caps. The bus driver looks at them. Other passengers look at them. And apparently everyone thinks, yeah, that seems normal. This actually happened. They make it to Jacksonville. They split up. 2 heads to Chicago, 2 to Cincinnati. And for a brief, miraculous moment, it seems like maybe the second team will succeed where the first is failing. but they don't understand what they've already done wrong. Let's talk forensics for a moment, because the uniforms were mistakes on levels the saboteurs never imagined. Detail number 1. German uniform buttons were distinctly different from U.S. Navy buttons. Different spacing, different stamping, different metal composition. Any tailor who examined them would immediately know they were foreign military issues. Detail number 2. Kriegsmarine wool had a unique texture. It was milled differently than American or British naval cloth. Under a microscope, the fiber pattern was unmistakable. FBI labs could identify German military textile on site. Detail number 3. These uniforms were brand new, issued specifically for this operation. They smelled of mothballs and the particular chemical preservatives used in German military depots. That smell doesn't wash off easily. It clings to skin, to hair, to anything it touches. Detail number 4. Even after burying the uniforms, even after changing into civilian clothes, traces remained. Sand and salt water had soaked into the wool, then transferred to their skin. When they dressed in civilian clothes, fibers transferred. Microscopic evidence that FBI forensics could match. The deeper mistake, the one that reveals how fundamentally the Germans misunderstood their enemy, was thinking the uniforms were protection. In reality, they were evidence. They were confessions. They were a trail that led directly to every man who'd worn them. The Abwehr had equipped their elite saboteurs with the one thing guaranteed to destroy them. But the uniforms weren't the only clothing mistake these men made. When they tried to blend into wartime America, wearing their carefully selected civilian clothes, every thread they wore screamed enemy agent. And that's where this story gets truly unbelievable. When the FBI finally arrested all 8 saboteurs and laid their civilian clothing out for forensic examination, what they found was almost comical in its incompetence. These weren't just mistakes. These were catastrophic failures at every level of operational planning. Let's start with the clothes themselves. The suits were brand new, American-made, purchased through intermediaries in Lisbon and Paris, cities where you could still buy American goods in 1942. From a distance, they looked perfect. Good fabric, proper styling, the kind of conservative business attire a working-class American might wear. But the moment you looked closer, everything fell apart. The suits were cut in 1939 styles. Wider lapels, different pocket placement, trouser cuts that had gone out of fashion 3 years earlier. And here's why that mattered. Wartime fabric rationing had changed American clothing completely. In 1942, the War Production Board had issued regulations limiting how much fabric could go into civilian garments, narrower lapels, shorter jacket lengths, no cuffs on trousers, no vests. These weren't fashion choices, they were law. Every suit manufactured in America after 1942 followed these regulations. Every man walking down the street wore them. You could spot a pre-war suit instantly. And these saboteurs were wearing clothing that announced, "I haven't been shopping in America since 1939. The ties were worse. Pre-war patterns. Designs that hadn't been manufactured since before Pearl Harbor. Fabric weights that were no longer produced because the materials had been redirected to military use. But the shoes were the deadliest mistake of all. Every single saboteur was wearing leather-soled shoes. In rationing America, that was impossible. The War Production Board had restricted leather for military use. Civilian shoes had rubber soles, reclaimed rubber, synthetic rubber, anything but leather. You literally could not buy news. Leather-soled shoes in an American store in 1942, unless you were military or law enforcement. So, when FBI agents examined the saboteurs' footwear, they didn't need forensic analysis. They just needed eyes. These men were wearing shoes that no American civilian could obtain, shoes that screamed foreign purchase. One tailor in New York, shown photographs of the clothing after the arrests, said, "I could have spotted them from across the street. Everything about them was wrong. The cut, the fabric, the wear patterns. They looked like men playing dress-up in American costumes." That's exactly what they were. Talking about the money, $84,000, distributed among 8 men, roughly $10,500 each. In 1942, the average American worker earned about $25 a week. That's roughly $1,300 a year. These men were each carrying the equivalent of 8 years of salary in cash. But it gets worse. The bills were crisp, sequential, and some were in denominations that had been withdrawn from circulation. The Treasury Department had stopped printing certain high-denomination bills and recalled others due to counterfeiting concerns and wartime financial controls. The saboteurs were carrying money that any bank teller would immediately flag as suspicious. But even if the bills had been legitimate, the sheer amount raised questions. You walk into a hotel in 1942 carrying thousands in cash. The manager remembers you. You buy a train ticket with a $100 bill. The clerk remembers you. You pay for dinner with sequential $50 bills. The waiter remembers you. These men weren't blending in. They were creating trails of witnesses everywhere they went. George Dash checked into New York's Governor Clinton Hotel and paid for a week in advance with cash that probably represented more money than the desk clerk made in a year. The clerk later testified that he'd never seen anyone pay like that. It stuck in his memory like a flashing neon sign. Every shopkeeper, every landlord, every restaurant owner these men interacted with would remember them. Not because they acted suspicious, because their money was suspicious. The Abwehr had given them fortunes and told them to blend in. They might as well have given them signs saying, "Please investigate me." But the most elaborate failure was the ration books. Wartime America ran on rationing: food, gasoline, clothing, shoes, sugar, coffee, meat. Everything was controlled. You needed ration stamps to purchase anything. No stamps, no sale. The Abwehr knew this. They'd studied the American rationing system carefully. They'd obtained samples through neutral countries and intelligence channels, and they'd created forgeries that were, technically speaking, nearly perfect. The printing was accurate. The paper stock was correct. The stamp designs matched authentic books. But they didn't match the current issuance schedules. Here's what the Germans didn't know. British intelligence through the double-cross system had been feeding false information to German spies for years. One of the things MI5 had deliberately leaked were outdated ration book designs with subtle, intentional errors. The books the Abwehr forged were based on those compromised designs. They looked real. They felt real. But they had built-in tells, slight misalignments and stamp perforations, wrong serial number sequences, outdated validation codes. Any experienced shopkeeper who handled ration books daily would notice. But even if the books had been perfect, the saboteurs didn't understand how to use them. One agent, FBI records suggest it was Werner Thiel, though accounts vary, walked into a restaurant and tried to pay for his meal with ration stamps. Ration books aren't currency, they're permission slips. You use them alongside money to prove you're entitled to purchase ration goods. You don't hand them to a waiter like they're dollar bills. The waiter stared at him. "Sir, you pay with money. The stamps just show you're allowed to buy the food." Thiel reportedly looked confused, then embarrassed, then paid with cash and left quickly. The waiter told the story to his manager. The manager mentioned it to a regular customer who happened to be a cop. The cop filed a report. One mistake in a restaurant. That's all it took to start a chain of attention that would eventually reach the FBI. The cultural blindness went deeper than ration books and money. American slang had evolved rapidly between 1939 and 1942. Not just new words, but entire ways of speaking. Wartime expressions, military jargon that had seeped into civilian life. Home front terminology that everyone understood instinctively. These men spoke perfect English, grammatically flawless, accent-free. But it was English from 3 years ago. British intelligence files, declassified decades later, documented similar problems with German spies landing in England. One agent didn't know that 2 and 6 meant 2 shillings and 6pence. He thought he was being charged £2 and 6 shillings for a train ticket. His confusion in front of the ticket clerk was immediate grounds for suspicion. Another agent in Britain tried to order a beer at 9 a.m., not knowing that wartime pub hours had changed. Pubs didn't open until noon under wartime regulations. His attempt to get served early marked him instantly as someone unfamiliar with current British life. The Pastorius saboteurs made similar mistakes, not documented specifically in FBI files, but implied in interrogation reports, small conversational errors, outdated references, slang that had fallen out of use. In peacetime America, these mistakes would have been forgiven as regional differences or personal quirks. In wartime America, where everyone was suspicious and paranoid and looking for enemy agents, every odd phrase was noticed and remembered. Every conversation was a minefield, and men didn't even know which words would detonate. But the most heartbreaking failure was Herbert Haupt. Haupt was 22 years old, born in Germany, but he'd been brought to America as a child and raised in Chicago. He knew the city intimately. He spoke English without a trace of accent. He understood American culture, not from training, but from living it. This should have made him the most dangerous member of the team. Instead, it destroyed him. Because Haupt made the mistake of going home. His parents still lived in Chicago. His girlfriend was there, his old friends from the neighborhood. He couldn't resist. After years in Germany, after the submarine journey, after landing on a Florida beach, he went back to the streets he'd grown up on. He walked into his parents' house on June 27th. His mother took one look at him and said, "Your suit looks foreign." Not "nice suit." Not "where have you been?" Your suit looks foreign. She'd lived in America long enough to recognize American clothing, and her son wasn't wearing it. His father noticed the shoes. "Where did you get those? We can't buy leather anymore." The very people who loved him most noticed immediately that something was wrong. Not because they suspected him of being a saboteur, they had no idea, but because his clothes didn't fit 1942 America. What Haupt didn't know was that the FBI was already watching his family. George Dash had given them names. The Chicago field office had put surveillance on the Haupt residence days before Herbert arrived. FBI agents watched him walk down his old street. They photographed him. They noted the foreign-cut suit, the leather-soled shoes, the way he moved like someone who'd been away for years and was trying to remember how things worked. Within 48 hours, they arrested him. His own familiarity with America had made him careless. He thought he could disappear back into his old life. Instead, his old life exposed him. Clothes his German handlers had given him to blend in, made him stand out to the people who knew him best. By late June 1942, the FBI had surveillance on multiple saboteurs. The net was closing. The clothing mistakes, the money, the ration books, the cultural errors, all of it had created a trail impossible to hide. But even as FBI agents compiled evidence and prepared to make arrests, they didn't know the most important fact. One of the saboteurs, the leader of the Long Island team, the man who'd shoved cash at John Cullen on that foggy beach, was already planning to confess everything. George Dash had worn that German naval uniform knowing he'd be spotted. He'd let Cullen see his face. He'd taken the mission knowing it would fail. And now, sitting in a New York hotel room, surrounded by money he couldn't spend, and wearing clothes that marked him as foreign, he made the decision that would doom his fellow saboteurs and save thousands of American lives. He was going to turn himself in. The question was whether the FBI would believe him. June 14th, 1942. Room 627, Governor Clinton Hotel, New York City. George Dash sits on the edge of the bed, staring at a suitcase filled with money he can't spend, wearing clothes that mark him as foreign, in a city that's hunting for him. He's been in New York for less than 48 hours since landing on that Long Island beach. 48 hours of living with the knowledge that John Cullen saw his face, that the Coast Guard found the buried uniforms, that the FBI is looking for German saboteurs, and he's wearing a suit that screams, "I'm not from here." Ernest Berger sits across from him. They've been talking in circles for hours. Finally, Dash says it out loud, "I'm turning myself in." Berger doesn't argue. He's been thinking the same thing. Berger is a naturalized U.S. citizen who made the catastrophic mistake of returning to Germany before the war. He knows America. He knows what happens to spies. And he knows this mission was dead the moment they put on those uniforms. "When?" Berger asks. "Tomorrow," Dash says. "I'll call the FBI." They both understand what this means. Confession might save them from the electric chair, or it might guarantee it. But staying silent, trying to complete this impossible mission, that's certain death. The uniforms haunt them even now. They're buried in the sand at Amagansett, but Dash can still feel the weight of that dark blue wool, the brass buttons, the military precision of the cut. Can still remember standing on that beach dressed like an enemy soldier, knowing he was visible, identifiable, doomed. Even in civilian clothes, they can't escape what they wore. June 15th. Dash picks up the phone in his hotel room and calls the FBI's New York field office. "My name is Franz Pastorius," he says, using the operations code name. "I just arrived from Germany. I have information about saboteurs." The agent on the other end of the line listens for about 30 seconds, then, "Sure, buddy, we get calls like this every day. Why don't you call back when you sober up?" Click. The FBI agent thought he was a crackpot, a drunk, a crazy person. Dash sits there holding the dead phone, realizing that even when he tries to confess, nobody believes him. He spends the next 4 days in an agony of indecision. Does he try again? Does he wait? Does he just disappear into America and hope the mission falls apart on its own? Finally, on June 19th, he makes a decision. He won't call. He'll walk into FBI headquarters in person, in Washington, D.C., where they can't hang up on him. June 19th, 1942. FBI headquarters, Department of Justice Building, Washington, D.C. Dash walks through the front doors, carrying a briefcase. He asks to speak to J. Edgar Hoover. He's told Hoover isn't available. He asks for whoever is in charge of German saboteurs. The receptionist looks at him like he's insane. He's shuffled from office to office. Each agent listens politely for a minute or two, then tries to pass him off to someone else. This guy is clearly delusional. German saboteurs landing on American beaches? Sure, pal. Finally, he reaches the office of D.M. Ladd, assistant director of the FBI, and the man actually running the manhunt for the Pastorius saboteurs. Ladd is buried in reports. His desk is covered with maps of Long Island, witness statements from the Coast Guard personnel, forensic analysis of the buried uniforms and explosives. He's coordinating the largest counterintelligence operation in FBC history. And this walk-in is claiming to be one of the saboteurs. Ladd gives him 5 minutes. "Make it quick." Dash starts talking. He describes the landing, the submarine, the uniforms, the training in Germany. Ladd is nodding politely, but his eyes are already drifting back to the papers on his desk. They get crazy people in here every day claiming to be spies, claiming to have secret information. This is just another. Dash lifts his briefcase onto the desk, open it, and dumps $84,000 in cash onto D.M. Ladd's desk. Stacks of bills cascade across the reports, the maps, the photographs, crisp, sequential, unmistakable. The room goes completely silent. Ladd looks at the money. Look at Dash, look at the money again. "Start talking," he says, "and don't stop until I tell you to." For the next 13 hours, Dash talks. He names all 8 men: George Dash, Ernest Berger, Heinrich Hank, Richard Quirin, Edward Curling, Herbert Haupt, Hermann Neubauer, Werner Thiel. He describes the targets: Hellgate Bridge, the rail connection that moves war materiel from the industrial Northeast to ports; Niagara Falls Hydroelectric Plant, aluminum production for aircraft; Philadelphia aluminum factories; Cincinnati and St. Louis railroad terminals; Jewish-owned businesses in New York. He produces a handkerchief with invisible ink. When FBI technicians develop it, it reveals addresses of German contacts in America, backup, communication protocols, emergency procedures. He details the timing devices, how dried peas can be used as delayed triggers, how sugar lumps dissolve at predictable rates, how razor blades can create electrical contacts. He describes the sabotage school at Quens Lake, the instructors, the training regimen, the selection process. He gives them everything, but the moment that changes everything comes when an FBI agent asks, "Why did you wear military uniforms?" Dash explains the Geneva Convention logic. If captured in uniform during landing, they'd be prisoners of war. If captured in civilian clothes, they'd be spies, executable immediately. The agent writes this down, then look up. "So you expected to be caught?" Dash hesitates. "The uniform was protection." "Protection?" The agent's voice is skeptical. "Or surrender?" And that's when the FBI realizes what the Abwehr never understood. These men were psychologically defeated before they ever touched American soil. The uniforms weren't tactical equipment. They were white flags disguised as military dress. The moment they put on those Kriegsmarine uniforms, they'd stopped thinking like saboteurs and started thinking like captured soldiers. The uniforms created the expectation of failure, and that expectation became self-fulfilling. Dash had worn that uniform knowing, on some level, that he'd be spotted, that the mission was impossible, that his only path to survival was confession. The uniform wasn't protection. It was psychological surrender in dark blue wool. The FBI moves with devastating efficiency. June 20th. Heinrich Heinck, Richard Quirin, and Ernest Berger arrested in New York City. FBI agents surround them in their hotel rooms. They don't resist. June 23rd. Edward Curling and Werner Thiel arrested in New York. They'd been under surveillance for days. The FBI just waited until they led them to safe houses and contact points. June 27th. Hermann Neubauer and Herbert Haupt, arrested in Chicago. Haupt's visit to his family made him trivially easy to find. Total time from landing to complete capture, 14 days. 14 days to dismantle what was supposed to be a 2-year sabotage campaign. J. Edgar Hoover calls a press conference. He announces that through brilliant FBI detective work and vigilance, all 8 German saboteurs have been apprehended. He takes full credit. He describes the Bureau's exhaustive investigation, the forensic analysis, and the nationwide manhunt. He never mentions George Dash. He never mentions the confession. He never mentions that one of the saboteurs walked into FBI headquarters and gave them everything, because that would make the FBI look reactive instead of proactive. It would make Hoover look like he got lucky instead of brilliant. The official story becomes the FBI caught them through superior intelligence work. The truth was, they caught them because the mission was doomed from the moment those men put on German naval uniforms. July 8, 1942. A converted courtroom in the Department of Justice building, the first military tribunal on American soil since the trial of Lincoln's assassins in 1865. 7 U.S. Army generals sit as judges. The proceedings are classified. The public knows the saboteurs have been caught, but not the details. National security requires secrecy. All 8 men plead guilty. The evidence is laid out on tables, the German Kriegsmarine uniforms, meticulously catalogued. Each brass button was photographed. Each insignia is documented. The uniforms are physical proof that these men came as military invaders, not as civilian criminals. Boxes of explosives, timing devices, fake ration books, the invisible ink handkerchief, and $84,000 in cash, still organized in the stacks Dash dumped on Ladd's desk. The defense attorneys, appointed by the tribunal, argue that the men never actually committed any sabotage. They were arrested before a single bomb was planted. At most, this is a conspiracy. The prosecution's response is devastating. These men came ashore on American beaches wearing enemy military uniforms and carrying explosives. The intent is not in question. The law is clear. Under the Articles of War, enemy combatants who enter U.S. territory out of uniform to commit sabotage can be tried by military tribunal and executed. But wait, didn't they wear uniforms? But here's the legal trap. They wore uniforms during landing, then changed into civilian clothes. The prosecution argues this proves they intended to operate as spies, not soldiers. The uniforms were deception, not identification. The uniforms that were supposed to protect them became evidence of their intent to deceive. The very thing the Abwehr thought would save them guaranteed their conviction. August 4th. All 8 men sentenced to death by electric chair. August 8th, 1942. District of Columbia Jail. Officials are nervous. The electric chair is relatively new to Washington. Nobody knows if the power grid can handle 6 executions in one evening. They order the lights turned off in surrounding city blocks to avoid brownouts. The executions begin at noon. Each man takes approximately 14 minutes, strapped into the chair. Electrodes attached, the hood, the switch. 3 surges of electricity, 2,000 volts, then 500, then another 2,000. 14 minutes from entry to being pronounced dead. Heinrich Heinck, Richard Quirin, Herbert Haupt, Edward Curling, Hermann Neubauer, Werner Thiel. 6 men died in 90 minutes. George Dash and Ernest Berger are not executed. President Roosevelt commutes their sentences. Dash to 30 years. Berger to life imprisonment. Why the difference? The FBI's official explanation. Dash turned himself in voluntarily before any sabotage. Berger cooperated after arrest. The unofficial truth. The FBI needs someone to point to as proof that confession brings mercy. Future German. Spies need to know that surrender is an option, but Dash doesn't get freedom. He gets decades in prison for betraying a mission he never believed in while wearing a uniform that guaranteed he'd be caught. The news reaches Berlin within hours. Hitler's rage is legendary. He summons Admiral Canaris and screams at him for 20 minutes. Witnesses report the Führer was so angry he was shaking. The quote that survives history is bizarre. "Why didn't you take Jews for that?" Historians have wrestled with this for decades. Hitler, the architect of the Holocaust, suggesting Jews would have made better spies? The most accepted interpretation. Despite his genocidal anti-Semitism, Hitler grudgingly respected Jewish intelligence and competence. He believed Jews were cunning, resourceful, difficult to catch. In his twisted logic, they would have succeeded where loyal Germans failed. Grotesquely, after Operation Pastorius, Germany did begin hiring Jews for certain intelligence roles, not out of any moral awakening, but from cold calculation. The operation's failure ended German sabotage attempts on the U.S. mainland for the rest of the war. In 1944, Operation Elster sent 2 agents to Maine. They were caught within weeks. Germany never tried again. And never again did they land agents wearing military uniforms. The legacy of Operation Pastorius was written in dark blue wool and brass buttons. Don't dress your spies like soldiers. April 1948. George Dash and Ernest Berger are released from prison and deported to the American zone of occupied Germany. They expect some understanding, some recognition that they'd saved American lives. Instead, they're treated as traitors. Germany, devastated, occupied, traumatized, has no sympathy for men who betrayed the fatherland, even if that betrayal prevented terrorist attacks. They're shunned, threatened, spat on in the streets. Dash tries to make a life. He settles in a small town, starts a business. Then media coverage identifies him. The traitor of Operation Pastorius. He has to flee to another town, and another, and another. In 1959, desperate to tell his side, he published a memoir, 8 Spies Against America. It sells poorly. Few care about his justifications. He died in 1992 at age 89, still insisting he'd done the right thing. His final interviews contain a haunting claim. I knew from the moment they gave us those uniforms that the mission was meant to fail. The Abwehr wanted us caught. They wanted to show Hitler they'd tried. We were never meant to succeed. Did Dash plan to defect from the beginning? Did he volunteer for the mission specifically as an escape route from Nazi Germany? Was the uniform his insurance policy? Proof he could claim he'd been compromised? We'll never know for certain, but the uniforms tell their own story. Today, intelligence services around the world study Operation Pastorius in training courses. British SOE spent fortunes ensuring their agents' clothing was authentic. They ground brand names off zippers with dental drills. British zippers said, "Lightning, a dead giveaway." They used thread imported from occupied countries. They transplanted labels from refugee clothing. Every button, every stitch, every wear pattern had to be perfect. CIA, MI6, Mossad. Modern intelligence agencies train agents obsessively on clothing details. Not just language and documents, but thread thickness, button styles, wear patterns, fabric aging. Modern spies receive clothes that have been worn, washed, aged deliberately. Nothing new, everything authentic. Because the lesson of Operation Pastorius is carved in stone. Your cover is only as good as the smallest detail. One wrong button can destroy months of planning. One outdated zipper can get you killed. The Pastorius uniforms weren't a mistake. They were a symptom of deeper failures. Germany sent men to infiltrate America who hadn't lived there in 3 years. They assumed Americans wouldn't notice foreign details. They followed protocol, wear uniforms for Geneva Convention protection, without considering that uniforms make you obvious targets. Wartime America was paranoid, observant, suspicious. Every shopkeeper was a potential informant. Every unusual detail was reported. And 8 men wearing the wrong clothes paid with their lives. Imagine if they'd succeeded. Hell Gate Bridge destroyed. Thousands dead in the explosion and train crashes. Northeast Rail paralyzed for months. Niagara Falls hydroelectric crippled. Aluminum production for aircraft, grinding to a halt just as the war in Europe intensified. Railroad terminals bombed, logistics chaos. Suitcase bombs in Jewish neighborhoods, terror spreading through American cities. U.S. war production delayed by months or years. Public morale shattered. The knowledge that enemy agents could strike anywhere, anytime, all of it prevented by swimming trunks, German, military caps, and uniforms that should never have been worn. By John Cullen's alertness on a foggy beach. By one man's realization that his uniform meant he was never meant to succeed. The smallest details in warfare aren't the dramatic battles or strategic decisions. Sometimes they're the clothes you wear, the buttons on your jacket, the thread in your suit. Operation Pastorius failed because Germany didn't understand that, in intelligence work, you're only invisible if every detail makes you invisible. And 8 men learned too late that their clothes were confessions. But Operation Pastorius wasn't the only time Nazi intelligence made catastrophic mistakes. There's another story, one that's even more bizarre. A German spy in Britain who was caught because he ordered a pint of beer at 9 in the morning, not knowing British pub hours had changed under wartime regulations. Another who tried to pay for a train ticket and demonstrated he had no idea how British currency worked. And a spy who blew his cover by trying to buy massive quantities of explosive precursors from a village pharmacy. The stories keep coming, and they're all waiting for you. So, here's my question for you. Did George Dash plan to defect all along? Was he a hero or a traitor? Did the uniforms doom this mission, or was it impossible from the start? Drop your theories in the comments. I read every single one. If you found this story as unbelievable as I did when I first researched it, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the bizarre, catastrophic, and overlooked moments of World War II. The next video will reveal more spectacular German spy failures. And trust me, some of them are even more absurd than swimming trunks and military caps. Thanks for watching. And remember, in war, the smallest details matter most. The wrong button can change history.